discuss. The idea is that when it comes to our resources, they truly are finite. There's a limited amount that's available, and a calculation is done on an annual basis where we look at, per country perspective, how much resource do we actually need. So here came about a concept in terms of the World Overshoot Day. And the idea behind it is that what is the magical day every year we achieve, well, achieve in inverted commas, in terms of the amount of resources that we have consumed. The key idea behind this is that in an ideal world, we should make it to the 31st of December as far as the number of resources that we have consumed. However, if you take a close look at the chart, what you'll notice is that we're very, very far from it. I realize that the picture is a little bit tiny, so I'm just going to point out a few things to you. Firstly, looking over here at the, I feel like a weather person right now, looking over here to the 25th of March, that is the date that Denmark has consumed all of its allocated resources for the year, on the 25th of March already. The same goes for Sweden on the 6th of April, Finland on the 10th of April, and Norway on the 12th of April. South Africa, sadly, does not fare that much better. We hit the magic number on the 4th of July already. What does that mean? That means that we're living in a world of deficit. We're at a point where we've actually borrowed against our resources, and we're already at the point that we're consuming next year's resources. That eventually will catch up with us, and we'll be left with a point where there are no resources to consume, never mind leaving anything for future generations. That's how dire the situation truly is. And as I say this to you, I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like all my hairs stand on end right now when we start to realize how critical the situation is. So what this places it in context is that South Africa, or Southern Africa, is a climate change hotspot. What that means is that we're quite susceptible to the impacts when it comes to climate change. That there are additionally certain areas in the world, such as the Nordic countries, where from a European perspective, will feel the impacts quite significantly. We will see an accelerated amount of droughts taking place, accelerated warmings. A few years ago, we experienced this in Cape Town ourselves, where South Africa is anyway a water scarce country, and we find ourselves at a point that droughts become a regular part of how we live our lives. Further to this, with global warming, we find that the earth becomes a lot more dry. There are certain areas that are deeply impacted from a temperature perspective. And to place this in context, last year, we had significant wildfires breaking out. We heard about things in Australia, in California, in the Amazon. This year is no exception. Turkey, Greece, all of our planet is now systematically under fire. And so there comes a point where we need to be able to do something with this. And with this, it means that we need to look at innovations to be able to make the shift a lot faster than we had originally planned to do. Sorry, guys. Now, here's an interesting one that I have to admit that I'm a tiny bit skeptical about, but I thought I would share this with you anyway. There's a survey that was done last year amongst a group of adults in the countries that are listed on the left-hand side of the chart. If you look at it, it's basically Europe. And they were asked, what should be given priority? Should it be the economy or should it be the environment? And clearly, what came out of this is the environment should be on focus. This is something that's quite key, because a lot of times when we have this discussion, the feedback is our current generation is not interested. We're all about making money. And instead, it's about the future generations, the millennials, who are much more critically aware of the impacts that we're having. But the survey shows that people are starting to recognize more and more that the environment is of critical importance, and to be able to place ourselves within that context. It's quite possible that the reason behind this is because of the impacts from the pandemic itself. So the slide that I'm showing you right now is with regard to the South African local context. The pandemic has brought it more sharply into focus, our resource insecurity. We see things such as energy, thank you, Eskom, as well as water becoming more and more prevalent. But together with this, what has been highlighted is the amount of food insecurity as an example that has been taking place. With this, there has been a response from a governmental perspective, and we see a stronger drive from a regulatory perspective. And to be able to place this in context, especially for those of you who are aware of the upcoming extended producer regulations and all of the things that fit together with this, to place this in context, if you look at being a brand owner or a producer, the amount of packaging that you generate individually as your own business, and then multiply that across the landscape. Factor into that our landfills are either reaching capacity or for the most part have already maxed out and have reached capacity. We're at a point where there's growing urbanization. We have no further space on the one hand to be able to have new landfills, and on the other, it's incredibly expensive to be able to have landfills put in, especially with the proper criteria in place. There has been a response from industry perspective, and we see a number of initiatives coming up from that side. There's things like the SA Plastics Pact Forum. We see the Consumer Goods Council having a voluntary agreement on food loss and waste. And there's quite a number of initiatives in terms of a response coming to that aspect. Finally, what we see is that there is a gradual and systematic shift towards looking at a circular economy focus, where the idea is recognizing that we have a finite amount of resources and finding ways to keep utilizing it and keeping it within the loop. And that is actually being supported to a large extent also from a governmental national perspective driver. And we see it with the latest national waste management strategy that has been announced. So what can we do? It's very clear we're in a state of emergency. How do we go about responding to that? There are clear ways to approach it. Looking at it from a planetary perspective in terms of a regenerative approach and how do we able to address this? We look in terms of the design of our cities and how we're managing it, recognizing the impacts that are coming from there. We look at the energy that we're generating and how that energy is being generated. And finally, most importantly, we look at the food that we're producing and how we're able to actually maximize this given the amount of resources that we currently have. So it's clear that our climate is in crisis, that we are facing a global challenge. So what can business do to be able to have an impact so that we can have the sustainable tomorrow that we keep talking about? So the key simple is subject to. You can recognize opportunities for innovation and collaboration, and you can actually look at defining climate change adaptation and mitigation pathways. In other ways, finding ways to be able to put certain measures in place. Take action. And this is one where I just want to take a moment to pause for a second. I had a very weird conversation with somebody last year. To be fair, I have a lot of weird conversations with people, but this one stood out in my mind because the feedback was, we have all of the stuff that we need to do, and I don't know where to begin. And I want to be able to craft this thing. And they were talking so much about crafting this thing, where my feedback was, why are you spending so much time crafting and making perfect? Every small step that you put into action makes a difference. Don't wait for perfect, take action now. And be transparent in terms of what you are doing. There's a final bit that I wanted to share with you in terms of the circular economy approach, especially when it comes to resources. During the course of last year, we were involved in a study that was commissioned by the European Union. And they wanted to be able to understand the state of the circular economy in the African continent. And the idea was that they looked at certain select countries across the African continent, and they also looked at the continent as a whole. The idea being, if Europe is moving towards circular economy principles, and Africa is essentially the hub where the resources come from a supply chain perspective, how do the two mesh up? How do we find a way that we are effectively engaging? And what the studies actually showed is that there is a transition that's taking place, albeit sometimes a tiny bit slowly, that areas such as agriculture, plastic, and the waste sectors in particular, they are progressing to a much more inclusive transition and recognizing that there are opportunities for a circular economy movement. We found that the green economy is acting as a baseline point in terms of being able to build on that as far as circular economy principles go, and that with that, there's very much a need in terms of capacity building. This is the key thing. We talk about these types of things in these types of events, but very seldom do we have these types of conversations in our normal lives. Very seldom, if at all, are we having these types of conversations on a school level, at universities, at places where we need to be able to make the changes, and we need to systematically build towards that. That's the key thing that actually came out of it. And with this, we need to recognize that in a South African landscape, we're at a point where the informal sector plays a pivotal role. So looking at this from an Africa perspective, looking at the continent holistically, what has come out is that there's a need for structure. There's a need for focus, and we need to actually formalize some of the existing dialogues. There's a lot taking place, but it's taking place in isolated pockets. And quite often there are a number of initiatives that are running in parallel when they could actually join up and become a lot stronger. And there's a lot of opportunity for something like that to take place. So therefore, the thought process is to have a unified circular economy action plan. So that is the baseline from where we are coming and the context for our discussions today. Scary, and I'm hoping tiny bit exciting. Yes.